Evelina Ashworth had traveled for 2 days to reach Duskmere Hall, and by the time the carriage rolled through the iron gates, her hands were stiff with cold, and her heart was tight with nerves. She had heard many things about the Duke of Ravensworth before she ever saw his face. The villagers spoke of him in careful whispers, the kind reserved for men who held great power and used it without warmth. Some said he had not smiled since his wife passed away. Others said he had never smiled at all, not even before that. Evelina did not know which story was true, but she knew one thing for certain. She needed this position more than she needed her pride. Her mother had died 3 winters ago, leaving behind debts that Evelina had spent every season since trying to repay. She had worked as a teacher's assistant, a seamstress, and briefly as a companion to an elderly widow in the next county, until the widow's health improved enough that her services were no longer needed. When the letter arrived offering her a position at Duskmere Hall, caring for the Dowager Duchess, Evelina had read it 3 times before she believed it was real. The wages were generous, the position was respectable, and so, despite the whispers about the Duke, she packed her one trunk and came. The carriage stopped before a house so large it seemed to swallow the sky behind it. Gray stone walls rose up in solemn rows, and dozens of windows caught the weak morning light like watchful eyes. Evelina stepped down, smoothing her plain traveling dress, and looked up at the entrance, where a tall butler waited, with his hands folded behind his back. "Miss Ashworth," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," she answered. "I've come about the position with the Dowager Duchess." "You are expected. Come this way." She followed him through a grand entrance hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. The floor was polished so brightly she could see her own reflection in it, faint and trembling. Evelina had never been inside a house like this before, and though she tried to keep her expression calm, her eyes could not help but widen at the sight of the high ceilings and the gold-framed mirrors. The butler, whose name she would later learn was Mr. Finch, led her down a long corridor and stopped before a set of heavy doors. "The Duke wishes to speak with you himself before you are taken to her grace," he said. This is not usual, but he insisted. Evelina's stomach tightened. She had expected to meet the housekeeper first, perhaps the Dowager Duchess herself, but not the Duke. Still, she nodded and said nothing, for saying nothing had always served her well in moments of uncertainty. Mr. Finch knocked once, then opened the door and announced her name before stepping aside to let her enter. The room was a study, dark with wood paneling and shelves of leather-bound books that reached the ceiling. A fire burned low in the hearth, though it did little to warm the air. Standing near the window, with his back to her, was a tall man in a dark coat, his shoulders straight as a soldier's. He did not turn immediately, and Evelina stood quietly, waiting, her hands folded in front of her. When he finally turned, she saw a face that matched every rumor, and yet somehow exceeded them. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years of age, with sharp features and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. There was no warmth in his expression, only a cool assessment, as though he were examining a piece of furniture he was not yet sure he wanted to purchase. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and measured, each word placed with care. "I am told you come with good references. I hope they will satisfy you, Your Grace. They will need to do more than satisfy me. My mother's health is fragile. She requires patience, and she requires someone who will not tire of her moods. Do you understand?" "I do, Your Grace. I cared for my own mother in her final years. I understand what patience means." Something flickered in his eyes at this, though it vanished before Evelina could name it. He studied her a moment longer, then walked slowly around his desk, his boots silent on the thick carpet. "There is one matter I must make clear before you begin your duties," he said. "It concerns how members of this household conduct themselves when accompanying me in public." Evelina waited, uncertain where this was leading. "My late wife," he continued, and here his jaw tightened slightly, "understood that a woman walking with me must walk 3 steps behind. It was her custom, and it has remained the custom of this house. You will be expected to observe it whenever you accompany myself or my mother beyond these walls." For a moment, Evelina simply looked at him. She had heard of such customs before, old and rigid rules passed down through noble families, meant to show respect, or perhaps meant to show something else entirely. She thought of her mother, who had walked beside her father every day of their marriage, hand in hand, never behind him, never beneath him. She thought of the quiet lessons her mother had given her, not in words but in the way she carried herself, the way she never let anyone convince her that her place was smaller than it truly was. Evelina did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply said, "I understand the custom, Your Grace, but I do not think I can follow it." The Duke's eyebrows lifted, just slightly, as though he had misheard her. "I beg your pardon?" "I will walk beside you, Your Grace, or I will walk at whatever distance is needed to do my duties properly. But I will not walk 3 steps behind, simply because I am a woman in your company. I mean no disrespect. It is only that I was not raised to believe that walking behind someone shows loyalty. I believe it only teaches a person to feel smaller than they are." The room went very still. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hold its breath. The Duke stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language, one he understood perfectly well, but had never expected to hear directed at him. No one spoke to him this way, not his steward, not his sisters, not even his own mother, who had learned long ago to choose her battles carefully. "You realize," he said slowly, "that I could dismiss you this very moment for such words." "You could," Evelina agreed. "And if you do, I will thank you for your time, and return to the carriage that brought me here. But I would rather leave with my honesty intact than stay here, having agreed to something I do not believe in." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing. He turned back toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back once more, and Evelina wondered if she had just thrown away the only opportunity that stood between her and the debt collectors who wrote to her every month with increasing impatience. She thought of her mother's face, of the modest cottage that had been sold to pay for medicine that had not, in the end, saved her. She thought of how easy it would be to simply nod and agree, to save herself the trouble of standing on principle, in a house so grand it could crush her without even noticing. But she did not move. She did not soften her words. She waited. "My mother," the Duke said at last, still facing the window, "has gone through 4 companions in the past 2 years. Each one left within a month, unable to bear her temper, or unable to bear the loneliness of this house. I do not have the patience to search for a 5th. "Then perhaps," Evelina said carefully, "you might allow the 5th to prove herself, before deciding she is unworthy." He turned to face her again, and for the briefest moment, something almost like amusement crossed his features, before it was smoothed away into his usual composed mask. "You are either very brave, Miss Ashworth, or very foolish." "Perhaps I am both, Your Grace." He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing something in his mind that had nothing to do with the words they had just exchanged. Then he said, "You may begin your duties this afternoon. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, will show you to my mother's rooms. As for the matter of walking—" He paused, and Evelina held her breath. "We will discuss it further, should the occasion arise. For now, it need not concern you." It was not an agreement, and it was not a refusal. It was, Evelina realized, exactly the kind of answer a man like the Duke would give when he did not wish to admit he had been surprised by something. She curtsied slightly, said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and left the study before he could change his mind. Outside in the corridor, Mr. Finch was waiting, his expression carefully blank, though Evelina suspected he had heard every word through the heavy door. He led her up a wide staircase and along another corridor, this one softer and warmer than the ones below, with pale curtains and vases of fresh flowers set on small tables. "Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess, can be difficult," Mr. Finch said quietly as they walked. "But she is not unkind. She has simply grown tired of losing people she has come to care for." "I understand," Evelina said. "I do not intend to be lost easily." Mr. Finch glanced at her sideways, and though his face remained composed, Evelina thought she saw the faintest hint of approval in his eyes. He stopped before a set of doors painted a soft shade of blue, and knocked twice. "Enter," came a voice from within, thin but sharp, like a blade that had grown old but not dull. The room beyond was filled with light, unlike the dark study downstairs. Tall windows looked out over gardens that stretched toward a distant line of trees, and seated in a chair near the window was an elderly woman wrapped in a shawl of deep burgundy, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap. Her eyes, when they turned to Evelina, were the same storm gray as her son's, though softer, weathered by years, rather than sharpened by anger. "So," the Dowager Duchess said, studying Evelina from head to toe, "you are the new one." "Yes, Your Grace. Evelina Ashworth." "And how long do you intend to stay, Miss Ashworth? A week? A fortnight?" "My last companion lasted 11 days, before she declared me impossible, and fled to her sister's house in the country." Evelina considered the question carefully before answering. "I intend to stay as long as I am useful to you, Your Grace, and as long as you wish to have me." The Dowager Duchess raised an eyebrow, a gesture so similar to her son's that Evelina nearly smiled. "That is not much of an answer." "It is an honest one," Evelina replied. "I cannot promise how long I will stay, because I do not yet know what kind of companion you need. But I can promise that I will not leave simply because the work is difficult." For a long moment, the Dowager Duchess said nothing, her sharp eyes searching Evelina's face, as though looking for some sign of deceit. Finding none, she gestured toward a chair beside her own. "Sit then. Tell me about yourself. And do not bore me with false modesty. I have had quite enough of companions who speak only in polite nothings." Evelina sat, and for the next hour, she told the Dowager Duchess about her childhood in a small village, about her mother, who had taught at the local school, about the years spent caring for her mother through illness, and about the quiet strength that had carried her through losses she had never expected to survive. The Dowager Duchess listened closely, occasionally asking sharp questions that tested whether Evelina's stories held together, and by the end of the hour, something in her stern expression had softened, just slightly. "You are not like the others," the Dowager Duchess said finally. "I hope that is a good thing, Your Grace." "That remains to be seen," the older woman replied, though there was no real coldness in her tone anymore. "But it is, at the very least, interesting." As the afternoon light began to fade into evening, Evelina was shown to her own small room at the end of the servants' corridor. Simple, but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the same gardens she had seen from the Dowager Duchess's rooms. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to breathe out the tension she had been holding since she arrived. She thought of the Duke's cold eyes and the strange stillness that had followed her refusal to accept his rule. She thought of the flicker of something unreadable that had crossed his face, gone before she could name it. She did not know what would happen next, whether he would insist on his old customs when the moment came, or whether their conversation in the study had planted some small seed of doubt in his rigid ways. What she did know was this: she had come to Duskmere Hall needing a position, needing wages, needing a way to keep herself from sinking further into the debts that had followed her since her mother's passing. But she had not come needing to lose herself in the process. Whatever waited for her in the halls of this great house, whatever trials the Duke or his household might bring, Evelina intended to walk through them exactly as she always had, with her head held high, and never, not for any title or any fortune, 3 steps behind. The morning after her conversation with the Duke, Evelina woke before the sun had fully risen. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around her, the distant creak of floorboards, the faint clatter of pots from a kitchen somewhere far below. She had slept better than she expected, though her mind had wandered more than once back to the study, to the Duke's storm-gray eyes, and the stillness that had followed her refusal. She rose, dressed quickly in her plainest gown, and made her way down to the kitchens, where Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, was already directing the morning's work with brisk efficiency. Mrs. Whitfield was a round, capable woman, with kind eyes, and a voice that could soften or sharpen depending on her mood. When she saw Evelina, she waved her over. "You'll be taking Her Grace her morning tea," Mrs. Whitfield said, handing her a tray. "She likes it strong, with just a little honey, no sugar, and she likes her curtains opened slowly, not all at once. She says the light hurts her eyes if it comes too fast."
"I'll remember," Evelina said, taking the tray carefully.
"You made quite an impression yesterday," Mrs. Whitfield added, lowering her voice slightly, though there was no one else nearby to hear. "The whole house is talking about it." Evelina felt her cheeks warm. "I did not mean to cause trouble." "Trouble," Mrs. Whitfield repeated, and to Evelina's surprise, the housekeeper's mouth curved into a small smile. "Miss Ashworth, this house has needed a bit of trouble for a long time. Everyone here walks so carefully around His Grace, as though the floor might crack beneath them. It was almost nice to hear someone speak plainly to him for once. He did not dismiss me, Evelina said, half to reassure herself. No, Mrs. Whitfield agreed. He did not. Make of that what you will. Evelina carried the tray up the wide staircase, balancing it carefully as she navigated the long corridor toward the Dowager Duchess's rooms. She knocked softly, and upon hearing the sharp voice bid her enter, she stepped inside, setting the tray down on the small table beside the window. The Dowager Duchess was already awake, sitting up against a mountain of pillows, her silver hair loose about her shoulders instead of pinned as it had been the day before. Without her lace cap, she looked older, more fragile, though her eyes remained just as sharp. "You are punctual," the Dowager Duchess observed. "That is a good beginning." "Thank you, Your Grace." Evelina poured the tea carefully, remembering Mrs. Whitfield's instructions, and handed the cup to the older woman. "Open the curtains," the Dowager Duchess instructed, slowly. "My eyes cannot bear a sudden flood of light in the mornings." Evelina moved to the window and drew the curtains back with careful, measured movements, allowing the soft morning light to spill gradually into the room. The Dowager Duchess watched her with something like approval. "You listen well," she said. "That is rarer than you might think." "I try to pay attention, Your Grace." The Dowager Duchess sipped her tea, studying Evelina over the rim of the cup. "My son tells me you refused his rule about walking behind him." Evelina's hands stilled for a moment on the curtain rope. She had not expected the subject to arise so quickly, nor had she expected the Duke to have mentioned it to his mother at all. "I did, Your Grace. I hope that was not improper of me to share such thoughts with him." "Improper?" The Dowager Duchess set her cup down with a small clink against its saucer. "My dear girl, half the women in this county would faint at the thought of contradicting my son. He has a way of making people feel very small when he wishes to. It is a talent he inherited from his father, unfortunately, along with several other traits I wish he had left behind." Evelina said nothing, unsure how much the Dowager Duchess wished to reveal, but the older woman continued anyway, her voice growing softer, more distant, as though she were speaking to herself as much as to Evelina. "His wife, Marguerite, used to walk 3 steps behind him everywhere they went. She thought it made her seem devoted, obedient, the picture of a perfect wife, and for a time, it seemed to please him. But underneath it all, she was doing exactly as she pleased in every other corner of her life, while he remained blind to it, comforted by the appearance of her loyalty." The Dowager Duchess paused, her eyes distant. When the truth came out, it broke something in him. He has spent every year since building walls, rules, customs, anything that might prevent him from being made a fool again. Evelina absorbed this quietly, understanding now why the Duke's rule had seemed less about tradition and more about control, about needing some visible proof of loyalty that could not be faked, even though such proof had once been faked so thoroughly it had shattered him. "I did not know," Evelina said softly. "I am sorry for his pain, Your Grace, but I still do not think I could have agreed to it, even knowing this." The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No," she said, "I do not suppose you could have, and perhaps that is exactly why he did not dismiss you." They spent the rest of the morning together, the Dowager Duchess directing Evelina through the small rituals of her days, which books she liked read aloud and which she found tiresome, how she preferred her embroidery basket arranged, the precise temperature of the room that eased the ache in her joints. Evelina listened and adjusted, learning quickly, and by midday, the Dowager Duchess seemed almost pleased, though she was careful not to say so directly. It was in the afternoon, while Evelina was walking the Dowager Duchess through the gardens for her daily exercise, that they encountered the Duke for the first time since the previous day's conversation. He was standing near the fountain, speaking with a man Evelina did not recognize, someone dressed in the manner of a steward or estate manager, holding a ledger book beneath one arm. When the Duke noticed his mother and Evelina approaching, he ended his conversation and turned to face them, his expression as composed as ever. "Mother," he said, inclining his head slightly, "you are looking well today." "I am looking exactly as well as I looked yesterday," the Dowager Duchess replied dryly. "But I thank you for the courtesy of pretending otherwise." A flicker of something crossed the Duke's face. Not quite a smile, but close enough that Evelina noticed it. His eyes shifted briefly to her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of their conversation in the study seemed to hang in the air between them, unspoken but present. "Miss Ashworth," he said finally, "I trust my mother has not been too difficult this morning." "Not difficult at all, Your Grace," Evelina replied. "Merely particular. I am learning her preferences quickly, I hope." "She is particular," the Dowager Duchess interjected, "because the world has given me very little else to control. Do not apologize for me, Evelina. I am not ashamed of my particularities." The Duke's gaze lingered on Evelina a moment longer than necessary, and she felt a strange warmth rise in her cheeks under his scrutiny, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. She kept her expression calm, her posture straight, and waited for whatever he might say next. But he said nothing further about the matter. Instead, he turned back to his mother. "I have business in the village this afternoon. I will return before supper." "Take Miss Ashworth with you," the Dowager Duchess said suddenly. Evelina blinked, caught entirely off guard by the suggestion, and judging by the brief tightening of the Duke's jaw, so was he. "Mother," he began, "I hardly think—" "Nonsense," the Dowager Duchess interrupted smoothly. "She has been cooped up in this house since her arrival, and I have letters that need posting at the village office. It is a simple errand. She may accompany you in the carriage, and see to my correspondence while you attend to your business." Evelina suspected, from the glint in the older woman's eyes, that this was not entirely about letters at all, but she said nothing, waiting to see how the Duke would respond. He hesitated only a moment before nodding stiffly. "Very well. Miss Ashworth, the carriage departs within the hour. Please be ready." "Yes, Your Grace," Evelina said, and if her heart beat a little faster at the thought of sharing a carriage with him, she told herself it was only nervousness, nothing more. The carriage ride to the village was quiet at first. The Duke seated across from her with his gaze fixed out the window, his expression unreadable. Evelina held the small bundle of letters the Dowager Duchess had given her, turning them over in her hands, searching for something to say that would not seem forward or foolish. It was the Duke who finally broke the silence. "My mother seems taken with you," he said, still looking out the window. "I hope that is a good thing, Your Grace." "It is unusual," he replied. "She does not take to people easily, not anymore. Perhaps she simply needed someone willing to listen to her, rather than someone who agreed with everything she said out of fear." The Duke turned his gaze from the window to look at her directly, and Evelina felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "You speak very plainly, Miss Ashworth. It is not a common trait among those in your position." "I have never seen the use in speaking otherwise," Evelina replied. "Flattery wastes time, and dishonesty wastes trust. I would rather offend someone with the truth than please them with a lie." Something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it was. "And yesterday? Was that plain speaking as well, or something else entirely?" Evelina met his gaze steadily. "It was the truth as I understand it, Your Grace. Nothing more, nothing less." He studied her for a long moment, the carriage rattling gently over the uneven road, before he looked away again, back toward the window and the passing countryside. "My father used to say that a man who surrounds himself only with those who agree with him will never learn anything worth knowing. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, in some matters. In others, considerably less so." The Duke's voice carried a note of something bitter, quickly suppressed. He said nothing further on the subject, and Evelina did not press him, sensing that some doors were not meant to be opened so soon. The rest of the journey passed in a silence that felt, strangely, less uncomfortable than before. When they reached the village, the Duke attended to his business at the estate office, while Evelina posted the Dowager Duchess's letters and took a few quiet moments to walk along the small row of shops, breathing in air that smelled of bread and wood smoke, rather than polished floors and old portraits. When the Duke emerged from his meeting, he found her standing near a small bookshop, gazing at a display in the window. He paused beside her, following her gaze to the worn copies of poetry collections arranged behind the glass. "Do you read poetry, Miss Ashworth?" "When I can afford it," she admitted, "which is not often." Without a word, the Duke stepped past her into the shop. Evelina watched through the window, startled, as he spoke briefly with the shopkeeper and pointed toward one of the volumes in the display. A few minutes later, he emerged and held out a small, neatly wrapped package toward her. "For my mother's collection," he said, though his eyes did not quite meet hers as he said it, and Evelina suspected the excuse was thinner than he intended it to sound. She enjoys being read to in the evenings. Thank you, Your Grace, Evelina said softly, accepting the package, understanding perfectly well that whatever his reasons, the gesture was not entirely about his mother at all. They returned to the carriage, in a silence that felt different from the one that had carried them into the village, lighter somehow, though neither of them spoke of it. As the carriage rolled back toward Duskmere Hall, Evelina glanced at the Duke and found him already watching her, his storm-gray eyes unreadable but no longer entirely cold. Neither of them mentioned the matter of walking behind him again that day, but something had shifted, quietly, in the space between them, and Evelina suspected that the silence itself had spoken more plainly than either of them dared to with words. 3 days passed before Evelina saw the Duke again, outside of brief, formal greetings in the hallways. He had thrown himself into estate matters with a fervor that Mrs. Whitfield described as unusual, even for him, spending long hours in his study with the steward, reviewing accounts and correspondence that seemed to multiply rather than diminish, no matter how many hours he devoted to them. Evelina did not mind the distance. It gave her time to settle into her new life at Duskmere Hall, to learn its rhythms and its people, and to grow closer to the Dowager Duchess, who had begun to treat her less like a hired companion, and more like someone whose opinions actually mattered. It was on a quiet afternoon, while Evelina was helping the Dowager Duchess sort through a chest of old letters and keepsakes, that the subject of the late Duchess Marguerite arose again, this time in far greater detail than the older woman had offered before. "You will find her portrait somewhere in this house," the Dowager Duchess said, running her fingers over a faded ribbon that had once tied a bundle of letters together. "Though I believe my son had it moved to the East Wing, where fewer people pass. He could not bear to see her face every day in the main hall." "You do not have to speak of her, if it troubles you, Your Grace," Evelina said gently, though her curiosity had grown considerably since their first conversation on the subject. "It troubles me less than you might think," the Dowager Duchess replied. "I was never as fond of her as my son was. Marguerite had a way of making everyone believe she was exactly what they wished to see. To my son, she was devotion itself, walking 3 steps behind him at every function, praising his decisions in public, deferring to him in every visible way. To others, she was something else entirely." Evelina set down the letter she had been holding, giving the older woman her full attention. "What do you mean, Your Grace?" The Dowager Duchess's mouth tightened into a thin line. "I mean that Marguerite understood exactly how to perform loyalty without ever truly possessing it. While she walked behind my son in public, showing the world a portrait of the perfect wife, she was elsewhere entirely in private, carrying on with a gentleman from a neighboring estate, for nearly 2 years before my son discovered the truth." Evelina's breath caught slightly at this revelation, though she tried not to let her shock show too plainly on her face. How did he discover it? A letter, misplaced by a careless servant, found its way into his hands instead of hers. He did not speak of it to anyone for weeks. I only learned the truth because I found him one evening in this very study, sitting alone in the dark, holding that letter as though it might change its meaning if he stared at it long enough. The Dowager Duchess's voice grew quieter. He was never the same after that. He built rules around himself, rules about loyalty and distance and appearances, believing that if he could control the outward signs of devotion, he might protect himself from ever being fooled again. "But rules cannot force someone to truly care," Evelina said softly. "They can only force someone to pretend." "Yes," the Dowager Duchess agreed, looking at her with something like approval. "That is precisely what my son has never allowed himself to understand. He wants proof he can see, proof he can measure, like a merchant counting coins. But loyalty is not something you can count, Evelina. It is something you can only trust, and trusting requires a kind of courage he lost the day he read that letter." Evelina thought of the Duke's cold eyes when she had first met him, the careful way he held himself, as though any misstep might expose some hidden wound. She thought of the flicker of surprise, and something else she could not quite name, that had crossed his face when she refused his rule. Perhaps, she realized, her refusal had not offended him nearly as much as it had unsettled him. Forcing him to consider that loyalty freely given might mean more than loyalty demanded. "Does he know you have told me this?" Evelina asked. "No," the Dowager Duchess admitted, "and I would prefer he did not learn of it just yet. He is a proud man, and pride does not take kindly to having its wounds discussed behind its back, even when the discussion comes from a place of care rather than gossip. Evelina nodded, understanding the weight of the trust being placed in her, and promised to keep the conversation private. They returned to sorting the old letters in a companionable silence, though Evelina's mind lingered on what she had learned, turning it over carefully, trying to understand the man whose household she now called home. That evening, as she made her way toward the kitchens for her own simple supper, she passed through the east wing by mistake, having taken a wrong turn in a corridor she was still learning to navigate. It was there, in a dim hallway lit by a single flickering lamp, that she found the portrait the Dowager Duchess had mentioned. Marguerite had been beautiful, there was no denying it. The portrait showed a woman with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, her expression composed into an image of gentle devotion, her eyes cast slightly downward, in a pose meant to convey humility. Evelina studied the painting for a long moment, searching the painted features for some hint of the deception the Dowager Duchess had described, but finding nothing, except the practiced calm of someone who had learned, long before this portrait was painted, exactly how to present herself to the world. "You have found her, then." Evelina turned quickly to find the Duke standing a short distance away, his expression unreadable in the dim light. She had not heard him approach, and she felt a flush of embarrassment at being caught studying the portrait so intently. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I lost my way, and did not intend to intrude." "There is nothing to forgive," he said, stepping closer, his gaze moving from Evelina to the portrait and back again. "Everyone in this house eventually finds their way to this hallway, whether by accident or curiosity. I imagine you have heard some version of her story by now." Evelina hesitated, unwilling to betray the Dowager Duchess's trust, but the Duke seemed to read her hesitation correctly, and gave a small, humorless smile. "You needn't protect my mother's confidence, Miss Ashworth. I know she speaks of Marguerite when she believes I am not listening. It does not trouble me as much as she thinks it does." "I am sorry for what happened to you, Your Grace," Evelina said quietly. "No one deserves to be deceived by someone they trusted so completely." The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Evelina wondered if she had overstepped, spoken too plainly about a wound that was not hers to touch. But instead of retreating into cold formality, he surprised her by continuing the conversation. "For 2 years," he said, his eyes still fixed on the portrait, "she walked exactly as I asked, 3 steps behind, at every gathering, every function, every public appearance. I believed, foolishly, that such visible devotion meant something. I built my understanding of loyalty around what I could see with my own eyes, because I did not trust myself to judge what I could not see. And now?" Evelina asked softly. He turned to look at her then, his storm-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Now I find myself questioning whether visible devotion means anything at all, or whether it is simply the easiest thing to fake." Evelina held his gaze, understanding that this conversation had moved far beyond simple pleasantries, into territory that felt fragile and important all at once. "I believe," she said carefully, "that true loyalty does not need to announce itself constantly. It shows itself in small moments, in honesty, even when honesty is difficult, in staying not because of rules, but because of choice." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Evelina thought, for the briefest instant, that he might say something more, might close the small distance between them, and speak the thoughts she could see moving behind his careful eyes. But instead, he stepped back, his expression smoothing once more into its familiar composed mask. "You should return to the kitchens before your supper grows cold, Miss Ashworth. Mrs. Whitfield does not take kindly to wasted food." "Yes, Your Grace," Evelina said, understanding that the moment, whatever it had been, was over for now. She curtsied slightly, and made her way back down the corridor, leaving him alone, with the portrait of the woman who had taught him not to trust what he saw. Over the following days, Evelina noticed small changes in the household, subtle enough that she might have missed them had she not been paying close attention. The Duke began joining his mother more frequently in the evenings, sitting with them, while Evelina read aloud from the volume of poetry he had purchased in the village. He said little during these sessions, but Evelina noticed the way his attention sharpened whenever certain verses were read. Verses about honesty, about the difference between appearance and truth. The servants, too, began to speak more openly around her, no longer treating her as a temporary presence, likely to vanish within the month, like the companions before her. Mrs. Whitfield shared small confidences about the household's history, and even Mr. Finch, usually so reserved, began offering brief observations about the Duke's moods that suggested a growing trust in her discretion. But not everyone in the household welcomed these changes. Evelina began to notice a woman who visited with increasing frequency, a distant cousin of the Duke's named Lady Constance, whose sharp eyes followed Evelina's movements through the halls with open suspicion. Lady Constance was beautiful, in a polished, deliberate way, every curl arranged with precision, every gesture calculated for maximum effect, and Evelina sensed, without needing to be told, that the woman harbored ambitions toward the Duke that had nothing to do with friendship. "She has been visiting more often since your arrival," Mrs. Whitfield mentioned one evening, as she and Evelina folded linens together in the small sitting room off the kitchens. "Lady Constance has had her sights set on His Grace since before his marriage to Lady Marguerite. She waited patiently through his mourning, believing her turn would come eventually." "And has it?" Evelina asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Not yet," Mrs. Whitfield said, with a knowing look that Evelina chose not to examine too closely. "But patience like hers does not simply disappear because a new companion has come to look after her Grace. I would be careful, if I were you, Miss Ashworth. Women like Lady Constance do not take kindly to anything, or anyone, that might stand between them and what they believe they are owed." Evelina considered this warning carefully as she finished her work that evening, thinking of the sharp, assessing looks Lady Constance had cast her way during her brief visits, looks that held none of the warmth the Dowager Duchess had come to show her, none of the quiet respect that had begun, however cautiously, to grow between herself and the Duke. She did not yet know what role Lady Constance might play in the story unfolding around her, but she understood, with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every difficult moment of her life, that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them the same way she had faced the Duke's rule on her very first day, standing firmly on her own feet, refusing to shrink herself for anyone's comfort, and walking always forward, never 3 steps behind. The autumn air had grown noticeably cooler by the time the physician's letter arrived, requesting that the Dowager Duchess be brought to the county town for a thorough examination of her declining health. The letter was brief and formal, but it carried an urgency that could not be ignored, and the Duke wasted no time in arranging the journey. "You will accompany us, of course," the Dowager Duchess said to Evelina, as though there had never been any question of it. "I will not sit for hours in some doctor's cold office without someone sensible beside me." "Of course, Your Grace," Evelina replied, though she noticed the Duke's eyes flicker toward her briefly when his mother made the announcement, an unreadable expression crossing his face before he returned his attention to the travel arrangements. They departed early the next morning, the carriage loaded with blankets and cushions, to ease the journey for the Dowager Duchess's aching joints. The Duke rode inside with them, rather than on horseback, which Evelina understood to be unusual, as Mrs. Whitfield had mentioned more than once, that His Grace preferred the open air to the confines of a carriage, whenever the weather permitted. The Dowager Duchess, tired from the early hour, drifted into a light sleep within the first half hour of the journey, her head resting against a cushion propped near the window. This left Evelina and the Duke sitting across from one another in a silence that felt, this time, less strained than the quiet that had once existed between them. "You have been good for her," the Duke said quietly, breaking the silence after some time, his eyes on his sleeping mother rather than on Evelina. "She sleeps more easily now. She complains less of the aches that used to keep her awake at night. She is a strong woman, Your Grace. I have simply tried to make her comfortable." "You have done more than that," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Evelina look up from her hands to meet his gaze. "She trusts you. That is not something she gives easily, especially not since my father's passing, and certainly not since the troubles with my marriage became known throughout the household." Evelina considered her words carefully before speaking. "Trust is not something that can be demanded, Your Grace. It can only be given, freely, when someone proves themselves worthy of it, over time, through small and consistent actions, rather than grand gestures." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Evelina wondered if he understood the deeper meaning behind her words, whether he recognized that she was speaking not only of his mother's trust, but of something broader, something that touched on the very rule he had tried to impose upon her on her first day at Duskmere Hall. "You are speaking of more than my mother," he said finally, his voice low. Perhaps I am, Evelina admitted, unwilling to retreat from the honesty that had become, in some strange way, the foundation of whatever understanding was growing between them. Trust cannot be measured by how many steps someone walks behind another person, Your Grace. It can only be measured by what they do when no one is watching, when there is no rule forcing them to behave a certain way. The Duke's expression grew thoughtful, and he glanced briefly toward his sleeping mother, before returning his gaze to Evelina. I have thought often, these past weeks, about what you said to me in my study on your first day. I have turned the words over in my mind, more times than I would care to admit. And what have you concluded, Your Grace? He was quiet for a long moment, the carriage wheels rattling steadily beneath them, the countryside rolling past the windows in shades of gold and brown, as autumn settled deeper into the land. I have concluded that perhaps I built my rules not to protect myself from deception, but to protect myself from ever having to trust anyone again. It was easier to demand a visible performance of loyalty than to risk believing in something I could not see or measure. Evelina felt a warmth spread through her chest at this admission, understanding the weight it must have cost him to voice such vulnerability aloud. That is a very honest thing to say, Your Grace. It is easier to be honest with you than with most people, he said, and then, as though realizing how much he had revealed, he looked away toward the window, his jaw tightening slightly, in the way Evelina had come to recognize as his method of retreating from too much openness at once. They fell into silence again, though it was a comfortable one, and Evelina found herself studying his profile as he watched the countryside pass, noting the small lines of worry around his eyes, the tension he carried in his shoulders even in moments of quiet. She wondered how long he had carried these burdens alone, surrounded by servants who feared him, and relatives who sought only to benefit from his position, with no one, until now, willing to speak plainly. The Dowager Duchess stirred awake as the carriage began to slow, approaching the outskirts of the county town, and the remainder of the journey passed in ordinary conversation about the physician they were to see, and the errands the Duke intended to complete while they waited. The physician's office was located in a tall, narrow building near the town square, and the examination itself took the better part of 2 hours. Evelina waited in the small anteroom alongside the Duke, the two of them sitting in chairs positioned near a window that overlooked the busy street below, filled with merchants and townsfolk going about their daily business. Do you think she will be well? Evelina asked quietly, watching a young mother herd her children past a bakery stall outside. I do not know, the Duke admitted. She has grown frailer this past year, though she hides it well when she has the strength to do so. I worry that we are running out of time to see her health improve, rather than simply slow its decline. She is fortunate to have a son who worries for her so deeply, Evelina said. She is fortunate to have you as well, he replied. And when Evelina glanced at him in surprise, she found his eyes already on her, steady and warm, in a way she had rarely seen from him before. I do not say that lightly, Miss Ashworth. I have watched you these past weeks, and I have seen how genuinely you care for her, not out of duty or wages, but out of something that seems to come naturally to you. Caring for people has always come naturally to me, Evelina said softly. My mother taught me that kindness costs nothing, but it is worth more than any coin. Your mother sounds as though she was a remarkable woman. She was, Evelina said, a note of quiet grief entering her voice, despite the years that had passed since her mother's death. I only wish I could have done more for her, in her final days. I wish I had known then what I know now about caring for someone whose body is failing them. The Duke was quiet for a moment, and then, to Evelina's surprise, he reached out and covered her hand briefly with his own, a small gesture, brief and almost hesitant, as though he were unsure whether such a touch would be welcomed. You did what you could, with what you knew at the time. That is all any of us can do. Evelina looked down at his hand covering hers, feeling a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the small fire crackling in the corner of the waiting room. She did not pull away, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. The physician's arrival to discuss the Dowager Duchess's condition broke the moment, and the Duke withdrew his hand quickly, standing to greet the doctor with his usual composed formality. But Evelina noticed, as they listened to the physician's careful explanation of the Dowager Duchess's condition and the treatments he recommended to ease her discomfort, that the Duke's eyes drifted toward her more than once, as though seeking some silent reassurance in her presence. The physician's news was neither entirely good nor entirely bad. The Dowager Duchess's heart, he explained, was simply growing tired with age, and while there was no immediate danger, she would need to rest more, avoid excessive strain, and be watched carefully for any signs of worsening symptoms. He prescribed a series of remedies and recommended a diet designed to strengthen her constitution, along with regular but gentle exercise, to keep her body from growing too weak. "You will need to be patient with her," the physician said, addressing both the Duke and Evelina, as though recognizing that the responsibility for the Dowager Duchess's care fell equally upon them both. "Her heart requires rest, but her spirit requires purpose. Do not let her become idle, but do not let her overexert herself either. It is a delicate balance." "We will manage it," the Duke said firmly, and Evelina noted the way he said "we," rather than simply referring to the household staff, as though he considered Evelina an integral part of the effort to see his mother through whatever years remained to her. The journey home was quieter than the journey out had been, the Dowager Duchess tired from the examination, and drifting in and out of sleep against her cushions, while Evelina and the Duke exchanged only occasional words, though the silence between them now felt entirely different from the cold formality that had once defined their interactions. It was a silence built on understanding, rather than distance, on shared concern for the woman sleeping between them, rather than on the rigid rules that had once seemed to govern every aspect of the Duke's behavior. As the carriage rolled through the gates of Duskmere Hall in the fading afternoon light, the Duke helped his mother down from the carriage with careful, gentle hands, and then turned to offer his hand to Evelina as well, a small courtesy that she suspected he had not extended to any servant or companion before her arrival. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, accepting his hand and stepping down onto the gravel drive. "Thank you, Miss Ashworth," he replied, "for everything you have done today, and every day since your arrival." Their eyes met for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before Mr. Finch appeared to assist with the luggage, and the moment dissolved into the practical business of settling the household back into its evening routine. But as Evelina helped the Dowager Duchess prepare for an early rest that evening, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the feeling of the Duke's hand covering hers in the physician's waiting room, to the warmth in his eyes when he had thanked her, to the growing sense that whatever walls he had built around himself after his wife's betrayal were beginning, slowly and carefully, to come down in her presence. She did not know where this growing understanding between them might lead, whether it was wise to allow herself to hope for something more than the professional respect that had begun to grow between them. She thought of Lady Constance's sharp, assessing eyes, of the ambitions Mrs. Whitfield had warned her about, and wondered what complications might arise should the quiet connection forming between herself and the Duke become visible to those who watched the household with less generous intentions. But as she extinguished the candles in the Dowager Duchess's room and made her way to her own small quarters at the end of the corridor, Evelina allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the warmth of hope kindling quietly in her chest, alongside the growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them the same way she had always faced difficulty, honestly, courageously, and standing firmly on her own 2 feet. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the gardens of Duskmere Hall with a thin layer of frost that clung stubbornly to the hedges even as the midday sun tried to burn it away. Despite the cold, the household had been thrown into preparation for a gathering the Duke had reluctantly agreed to host, a modest dinner for several neighboring families who had long expected such hospitality and had grown impatient waiting for it since the period of mourning had ended. Evelina had spent the morning helping the Dowager Duchess select which jewelry to wear, a task the older woman insisted required careful thought despite her repeated claims that she cared nothing for such gatherings anymore. "It is not for my own vanity," she explained, holding up 2 different necklaces for Evelina's opinion, "but because these people will judge my son's household by every small detail, and I will not give them the satisfaction of finding fault." "I think the sapphires, Your Grace," Evelina said. "They match the blue in your gown, and they do not overwhelm your features the way the emeralds might." "You have a good eye," the Dowager Duchess said approvingly, fastening the sapphire necklace at her throat. "Better than my own companion of 10 years ago, who once dressed me in a shade of yellow so unflattering that Lady Pemberton still mentions it whenever she wishes to insult me." Evelina laughed softly at this, and the Dowager Duchess's eyes crinkled with amusement at having drawn such a genuine response. Their relationship had grown steadily warmer over the weeks since the physician's visit, and Evelina found herself looking forward to these small moments of shared humor and quiet confidence between them. The guests began arriving as the afternoon light faded into early evening, carriages rolling up the drive in a steady procession, depositing well-dressed families who greeted one another with practiced warmth and appraising glances. Evelina remained close to the Dowager Duchess throughout the early part of the evening, assisting her through introductions and ensuring she did not tire herself standing too long in one place. It was Lady Constance's arrival that changed the temperature of the evening considerably. She swept into the drawing room in a gown of deep crimson, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, and made her way directly toward the Duke with a familiarity that suggested long acquaintance and perhaps something more that she wished others to assume. "Your Grace," she said, extending her hand toward him with a practiced smile. "It has been far too long since you have hosted such an evening. I confess, I have missed the pleasure of your company at these gatherings." "Lady Constance," the Duke replied, with the polite but distant courtesy Evelina had come to recognize as his default response to unwelcome attention. "I trust your journey here was comfortable. Comfortable enough, though I would have endured far worse for the pleasure of seeing you again." Her eyes flickered briefly toward Evelina, who stood a short distance away attending to the Dowager Duchess, and something sharp and assessing crossed her expression before she returned her full attention to the Duke. The evening progressed through the usual formalities of such gatherings, conversation flowing between discussions of the harvest, the weather, and the various small scandals circulating through the county's noble families. Evelina remained largely in the background, as was proper for her position, though she noticed Lady Constance watching her with increasing frequency throughout the evening, her expression growing colder each time their eyes happened to meet. It was during the transition, from the drawing room to the dining hall, that the confrontation Evelina had not anticipated finally arrived. The guests began moving in a loose procession toward the dining room, and as the Duke stepped forward to lead the way, Lady Constance moved quickly to his side, positioning herself directly beside him with the confident ease of someone accustomed to claiming such a place. "Your Grace," she said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough for those nearby to hear, "I noticed your companion trailing along without any clear place in your procession. Surely such matters of household order should be settled before guests arrive, rather than left to create confusion during the evening itself." Evelina, who had simply been walking a respectful distance behind the group as she assisted the Dowager Duchess, felt several pairs of eyes turn toward her at Lady Constance's pointed comment. She kept her expression composed, refusing to let the deliberate provocation show any effect on her outward demeanor. The Duke's jaw tightened, and Evelina saw something flash in his eyes, quick and sharp, though whether it was directed at Lady Constance's comment or at some deeper discomfort she could not immediately tell. "Miss Ashworth's place in this household is not a matter requiring discussion at a dinner gathering, Lady Constance." "Of course not," Lady Constance said smoothly, though her smile did not reach her eyes. "I only meant to observe that in your late wife's time, such matters were always so clearly arranged. Marguerite understood precisely where she belonged in relation to you, and she never caused a moment's confusion for your guests." The mention of Marguerite seemed to land heavily in the space between them, and Evelina noticed the Dowager Duchess's hand tighten slightly on her arm, though the older woman said nothing, watching the exchange with careful, assessing eyes. "Marguerite," the Duke said, his voice carrying a coldness that made several nearby guests fall silent, straining to hear the exchange despite their attempts to appear otherwise occupied. "Understood many things about appearances, Lady Constance. Whether she understood anything of substance is a matter I have come to question rather thoroughly in recent years." A ripple of surprise moved through the small cluster of guests, near enough to hear this remark, and Lady Constance's composed expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered herself. "I only meant to be helpful, Your Grace. I would not wish your household to appear disorganized before your guests." "My household," the Duke replied evenly, "is organized precisely as I wish it to be. Miss Ashworth walks wherever her duties require her to walk, whether that is beside my mother, behind my mother, or beside myself, as circumstance and courtesy demand, rather than as some rigid custom dictates." Evelina felt her breath catch slightly at these words, understanding the significance of what he had just said, publicly, before an audience of guests who would certainly carry word of this exchange throughout the county by morning. He had not simply defended her position in the household, he had explicitly rejected the very rule he himself had tried to impose upon her only weeks before. Lady Constance's eyes narrowed slightly, though she maintained her composed smile for the benefit of the watching guests. "How progressive of you, Your Grace. I confess I had not realized your views on such matters had changed so considerably since your marriage." "People change, Lady Constance," the Duke replied, his tone leaving little room for further discussion on the matter. "Some for the better, and some, unfortunately, only reveal over time what they were always capable of hiding." The pointed nature of this remark was not lost on anyone present, and Lady Constance's smile grew visibly strained as she seemed to search for some appropriate response that would not further embarrass her before the assembled guests. Finding none, she simply inclined her head slightly and allowed the procession toward the dining hall to continue, though Evelina noticed the way her eyes lingered on her with open hostility as they passed. Dinner proceeded with careful attention to ordinary conversation, though Evelina could sense an undercurrent of curiosity among the guests, who exchanged subtle glances and whispered comments whenever they believed themselves unobserved. She sat at a modest position at the table, befitting her role, though she noticed the Duke's attention drifting toward her more than once throughout the meal, his eyes seeking hers across the length of the table, in moments when he believed the conversation around him did not require his full attention. After dinner, as the guests dispersed into smaller groups throughout the drawing room and adjoining gallery, Evelina found herself briefly alone near a tall window overlooking the frost-covered gardens, having stepped away from the Dowager Duchess's side, while the older woman engaged in conversation with several old friends who had known her for decades. "You handled Lady Constance's provocation admirably," a voice said quietly beside her, and Evelina turned to find the Duke had approached, his expression more open than she had seen it throughout the formal proceedings of the evening. "I did nothing, Your Grace. I simply remained silent and let the matter resolve itself." "Sometimes silence is its own form of strength," he replied. "I have come to understand that about you, Miss Ashworth, more than I ever expected to when we first met." Evelina studied his face carefully in the soft candlelight, noting the sincerity in his expression, the absence of the careful, guarded formality that had once characterized nearly every interaction between them. "Your words to Lady Constance were quite direct, Your Grace. I imagine they will be the subject of considerable discussion throughout the county in the coming days." "Let them discuss it," he said, with a note of something almost defiant in his voice. "I am tired of arranging my household, and my own behavior, around rules that were never truly about loyalty or respect, but about my own fear of being deceived again. You showed me that on your very first day here, though it has taken me considerably longer than it should have to fully understand the lesson." "I am glad," Evelina said softly, "that you have found some peace in setting aside those old rules, Your Grace." "I have found more than peace," he replied, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite the formal setting surrounding them. "I have found, in your presence, a kind of honesty I did not believe I would encounter again after Marguerite. I do not yet know what to make of it entirely, but I find myself unwilling to simply ignore it any longer." Before Evelina could formulate a response to this unexpected admission, the Dowager Duchess's voice called softly from across the room, requesting her assistance with a shawl that had slipped from her shoulders, and the moment between them dissolved into the practical demands of the evening's remaining hours. But as Evelina crossed the room to attend to the Dowager Duchess, she felt the Duke's eyes following her, and she understood, with a mixture of hope and apprehension, that whatever quiet transformation had begun within him since her arrival at Duskmere Hall, it had reached a point now where it could no longer remain entirely private, hidden away from the watchful eyes of a household and a county that would have much to say about a duke who had finally chosen to walk beside someone, rather than demanding they walk behind him. News of the dinner party's confrontation spread through the county with the speed Evelina had feared it might. Within days, Mrs. Whitfield reported that the servants of neighboring households had already begun whispering about the Duke's pointed remarks to Lady Constance, and about the companion who had somehow earned such open defense from a man known throughout the region for his coldness and rigid formality. "They are saying all manner of things," Mrs. Whitfield confided one evening, as she and Evelina prepared the linens for the following day. "Some say His Grace has finally recovered from his grief and found happiness. Others say something far less kind, suggesting you have somehow schemed your way into his favor for your own advancement. Evelina felt a chill at these words that had nothing to do with the cold winter air seeping through the windows. I have done nothing to encourage such talk, Mrs. Whitfield. I have only tried to do my duties honestly. I know that, Mrs. Whitfield said gently, and so does everyone in this household who has watched you these past months. But the world beyond these walls does not know you as we do, Miss Ashworth. They know only what Lady Constance and her circle choose to tell them, and Lady Constance has never been known for generosity toward those she perceives as rivals. The truth of Mrs. Whitfield's warning became evident within the week, when a letter arrived at Duskmere Hall addressed to the Dowager Duchess from an old acquaintance in a neighboring county, containing news that had apparently already begun circulating through several noble households. The letter suggested, in the careful, veiled language such correspondence typically employed, that the Duke's companion had perhaps overstepped the boundaries appropriate to her position, and that certain parties questioned whether her continued presence at Duskmere Hall reflected well upon the family's reputation. The Dowager Duchess read the letter twice before setting it down upon her writing desk with considerably more force than the paper warranted. "Foolishness," she muttered, though Evelina, standing nearby, could see genuine anger simmering beneath the older woman's composed exterior. Utter foolishness, spread by people who have nothing better to occupy their idle minds. "Your Grace, if my presence here is causing difficulty for the family's reputation, perhaps it would be better if I—" "Do not finish that sentence," the Dowager Duchess interrupted sharply, fixing Evelina with a stern look that brooked no argument. "I will not have you speaking of leaving simply because a handful of jealous, small-minded people have decided to manufacture scandal where none exists. You have done nothing wrong, Evelina, and I will not allow gossip to dictate the composition of my own household." "Thank you, Your Grace," Evelina said, though the knot of worry in her chest did not entirely loosen despite the older woman's firm support. "I know precisely where this letter originated," the Dowager Duchess continued, tapping the offending paper with one finger. "Lady Constance has friends throughout the county, and I have no doubt she has been busy these past days, ensuring that word of my son's remarks at dinner reaches every household that might care to gossip about it. She is attempting to manufacture pressure upon my son, hoping that concern for the family's reputation might succeed where her own charms have so thoroughly failed to secure his affection." Evelina considered this assessment, understanding the logic behind it, even as she felt a growing unease about what such schemes might ultimately mean for her position within the household, and for whatever fragile understanding had begun to grow between herself and the Duke. "Do you think it will work, Your Grace? Do you think such pressure might convince His Grace to reconsider my place here?" The Dowager Duchess's expression softened slightly as she studied Evelina's worried face. "My son has weathered considerably worse than idle gossip, Evelina. He endured the whispers that followed Marguerite's betrayal, whispers far more damaging than anything Lady Constance can manufacture now. If anything, I suspect such pressure will only strengthen his resolve, rather than weaken it. My son has never responded well to being told how he must behave." This assessment proved accurate sooner than either of them expected. The Duke arrived at his mother's rooms that same evening, his expression carrying the particular tightness Evelina had learned to associate with barely controlled anger. A folded letter clutched in one hand that appeared similar to the one his mother had received earlier that day. "You have heard, then," the Dowager Duchess said, before he could speak, gesturing toward the letter in his hand. "I have heard considerably more than I care to repeat in polite company," he replied, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "It seems half the county has decided to concern themselves with the composition of my household, as though my personal affairs were suddenly a matter of public debate. And what do you intend to do about it?" the Dowager Duchess asked, watching her son carefully. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving briefly to Evelina, who stood near the window, uncertain whether her presence was welcome during what felt like a private family matter. "I intend to do nothing at all," he said finally. "I will not dismiss Miss Ashworth simply because Lady Constance and her circle of gossips have decided to manufacture scandal from nothing. I have spent enough years of my life arranging my behavior around the expectations of others. I do not intend to continue that pattern now, particularly not when the cause is so entirely without merit." Relief flooded through Evelina at these words, though she remained quiet, understanding that this conversation was primarily between mother and son, even if it concerned her own future quite directly. "I am glad to hear it," the Dowager Duchess said, "though I imagine Lady Constance will not simply abandon her efforts because her first attempt has failed to produce the result she desired." "No," the Duke agreed grimly, "I imagine she will not." His prediction proved correct within days, though the next attempt came in a form none of them had anticipated. Evelina was summoned unexpectedly to a small parlor rarely used by the household, where she found Lady Constance waiting alone, seated with deliberate composure near the cold hearth, her expression carrying none of the polished warmth she typically displayed in the Duke's presence. "Miss Ashworth," Lady Constance said, her voice carrying a coldness that made the room feel considerably colder than the unlit fireplace alone could account for. "I thought it time we spoke plainly, woman to woman, without the pretense of politeness that seems to govern our interactions when others are watching." "I am not certain what we have to discuss, Lady Constance," Evelina replied carefully, remaining standing near the doorway rather than accepting the implicit invitation to sit that Lady Constance's posture suggested. "Do you not?" Lady Constance's smile carried no warmth whatsoever now, stripped of the practiced charm she typically employed before an audience. "Let us dispense with false ignorance, Miss Ashworth. You have inserted yourself into this household with remarkable skill, winning over the Dowager Duchess's affections, and apparently the Duke's as well, in a manner considerably beyond what any reasonable companion's position should require." "I have done my duties honestly, Lady Constance, nothing more." "Honestly," Lady Constance repeated, the word dripping with skepticism. "How convenient that your honesty has resulted in such favorable treatment from a man who has shown affection to no woman since his wife's betrayal became known. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, did you plan this from the very beginning, or did the opportunity simply present itself once you understood the wounds you might exploit?" Evelina felt anger rise within her at this accusation, though she kept her voice level and calm, refusing to give Lady Constance the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. "I have exploited nothing, Lady Constance. Whatever regard His Grace has shown me has grown from honesty and mutual respect, not from any scheme or manipulation on my part." "Mutual respect," Lady Constance scoffed. "How romantic that sounds. It's coming from a woman whose position in this household depends entirely upon the continued goodwill of the family she serves. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, what happens to your mutual respect should the Duke tire of your company, as men so often tire of novelty? Where will your honesty and dignity carry you then, when you find yourself dismissed without position or reputation, having overreached so considerably beyond your proper station?" The threat, thinly veiled beneath Lady Constance's cutting words, was unmistakable, and Evelina felt a cold apprehension settle in her stomach, despite her determination not to let it show on her face. "I have not overreached anything, Lady Constance. I have simply done my work and spoken honestly when honesty was called for. Whatever comes of that is not something I can control, nor would I wish to control it through the kind of manipulation you seem to be suggesting." "How noble," Lady Constance said, rising from her seat with fluid, deliberate grace. "We shall see how long such nobility serves you, Miss Ashworth, when the full weight of this county's judgment finally falls upon your shoulders. I have patience, and I have connections throughout every household that matters in this region. You would do well to remember that, before you grow too comfortable in a position that was never meant to last." She swept from the room without waiting for a response, leaving Evelina standing alone near the cold hearth, her hands trembling slightly, despite her outward composure. She understood now, with clarity she had perhaps avoided facing before, that Lady Constance would not simply abandon her ambitions toward the Duke, nor would she hesitate to use whatever means necessary to remove whatever obstacle Evelina represented to those ambitions. That evening, as Evelina helped the Dowager Duchess prepare for bed, the older woman noticed her unusual quietness and pressed gently until Evelina relayed the substance of her encounter with Lady Constance, though she softened certain details to avoid causing the Dowager Duchess undue distress. "That woman," the Dowager Duchess said, her expression darkening considerably, "has always possessed more ambition than character. I will speak with my son about this matter directly. Please, Your Grace, there is no need to trouble him with—" "There is every need," the Dowager Duchess interrupted firmly. "If Lady Constance believes she can threaten members of this household without consequence, she is sorely mistaken about the nature of the family she is dealing with. My son may have built walls around his heart these past years, but he has never tolerated cruelty toward those under his protection, and I do not intend to let him remain ignorant of Lady Constance's true character any longer." Evelina said nothing further, though she felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and apprehension at the thought of what consequences might follow from the Dowager Duchess's evident determination to address Lady Constance's behavior directly with her son. She did not know what the coming days would bring, but she understood, with growing certainty, that the quiet peace she had found at Duskmere Hall was about to be tested in ways she had not yet fully anticipated. The Dowager Duchess did not delay in speaking with her son about Lady Constance's behavior, and though Evelina was not present for that conversation, she saw its effects the following morning, when the Duke appeared at breakfast with an expression of controlled fury that made even Mr. Finch move about his duties with unusual quietness. "My mother tells me you spoke with Lady Constance yesterday," the Duke said, finding Evelina alone in the small library where she had gone to select a book for the Dowager Duchess's afternoon reading. "She would not tell me the particulars, saying only that it was not her place to repeat your private conversation. But I would like to hear it from you directly, if you are willing to share it." Evelina hesitated only a moment before recounting the conversation as accurately as she could remember it, watching the Duke's jaw tighten progressively as she spoke, his hands clenching at his sides by the time she reached Lady Constance's veiled threats about her future position and reputation. "She had no right," he said, his voice low and controlled, in the way Evelina had come to recognize as far more dangerous than open shouting would have been. "No right whatsoever to speak to you in such a manner, in my own household, under my own roof. I do not think she cares much for questions of right, Your Grace. I believe she cares only for what she wants, and for removing whatever stands between her and that desire. Then she will learn," the Duke said, "that some things cannot be removed, simply because she wishes them gone." He paused, studying Evelina's face with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "There is a ball at Lord Pemberton's estate in a fortnight's time. I had intended to attend alone, as I have done these past years, arriving and departing with minimal social obligation. I find now that I would prefer to attend differently." Evelina's heart quickened at the implication in his words, though she kept her voice carefully steady. "Differently, Your Grace? I would like you to accompany me," he said, holding her gaze steadily. "Not as my mother's companion attending in some peripheral capacity, but at my side, openly, before every gossiping tongue in this county who has decided to concern themselves with matters that are, in truth, entirely my own affair." The boldness of this suggestion left Evelina momentarily speechless. She understood precisely what such an appearance would mean, how it would be interpreted by every eye that witnessed it, and how thoroughly it would confirm every rumor that Lady Constance and her circle had been so eager to spread throughout the county. "Your Grace, I do not think that would ease the difficulties we currently face. If anything, it might. It might confirm what is already true," he interrupted gently, though firmly. "I am tired, Miss Ashworth, of pretending that my regard for you is something to be hidden or managed for the comfort of people whose opinions I do not value in the slightest. Lady Constance wishes to control this narrative through threats and gossip. I would rather simply tell the truth, plainly, before an audience that cannot then twist it into something it is not." Evelina studied his face carefully, searching for any hesitation or doubt behind his words, but finding only steady resolve. "And what is the truth, Your Grace, that you wish to tell them?" "That I have found, in your company, an honesty I feared I would never encounter again after my marriage. That I have come to value your presence in ways that extend considerably beyond the duties you were hired to perform. That I would rather face whatever scandal results from acknowledging this truth than continue pretending it does not exist, simply to preserve some comfortable fiction for the benefit of people who have never wished me well regardless." Evelina felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the sincerity and courage behind his words, understanding the significant risk he was proposing to take, not only for his own reputation but for hers as well. "I would be honored to accompany you, Your Grace, though I confess I am frightened of what such an evening might bring. I will not let you face it alone," he said, and something in his voice carried a promise that reached far beyond the immediate concern of a single evening's social gathering. The fortnight passed with the peculiar combination of anticipation and dread, and when the evening of the ball finally arrived, Evelina found herself dressed in a gown the Dowager Duchess had insisted upon providing, a deep blue silk that complemented her dark hair and brought out the warmth in her eyes. considerably finer than anything Evelina had ever owned before. "You look lovely," the Dowager Duchess said, studying her with evident satisfaction, as Evelina turned before the mirror in her small room. "Lady Constance will find nothing to criticize in your appearance tonight, whatever else she might attempt." The carriage ride to Lord Pemberton's estate carried a tension that Evelina could feel in every mile they traveled, though the Duke's hand found hers partway through the journey, offering silent reassurance that steadied her nerves considerably more than words might have managed. Lord Pemberton's estate blazed with light when they arrived, every window illuminated, the sound of music and conversation spilling out into the cold evening air, as carriages deposited guests in a steady stream before the grand entrance. The Duke helped Evelina down from the carriage with careful attention, and then, rather than walking ahead as custom might have once dictated, he offered her his arm, and together, they walked up the wide steps and into the brilliant light of the entrance hall. The effect of this simple gesture rippled through the assembled guests almost immediately. Evelina felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward them, whispered conversations pausing mid-sentence, as heads turned to observe the Duke of Ravensworth, arriving not alone, as had become his custom, but with his mother's companion on his arm, walking beside him, rather than trailing behind as propriety and old custom might have suggested. "Your Grace," their host said, greeting them at the entrance to the grand ballroom with carefully controlled surprise. "What a pleasure to see you this evening, and accompanied so charmingly." "Lord Pemberton," the Duke replied evenly. "May I present Miss Evelina Ashworth?" The introduction, simple as it was, carried enormous weight, and Evelina understood, from the subtle shift in Lord Pemberton's expression, that he recognized precisely what such a presentation implied about her standing in the Duke's regard. They moved further into the ballroom, and Evelina forced herself to maintain a composed exterior, despite the continued attention their arrival had generated, focusing instead on the warmth of the Duke's arm beneath her hand, and the steady reassurance of his presence beside her. It was perhaps an hour into the evening, as they paused near the refreshment tables between dances, that Lady Constance finally made her approach, resplendent in a gown of deep gold that caught the candlelight with every movement, her expression carrying a brittle smile that did not quite mask the anger simmering beneath it. "Your Grace," she said, her voice pitched to carry to the small cluster of guests nearby, who had positioned themselves within convenient hearing distance, sensing perhaps that an interesting confrontation might be unfolding. "How bold of you to bring your mother's companion to such a distinguished gathering. I confess I did not expect you to be quite so open about your arrangements." "Lady Constance," the Duke replied, his voice carrying an edge of warning that Evelina had learned to recognize, "I would advise you to consider your words carefully before continuing." "I only speak what half this room is already whispering, Your Grace," Lady Constance continued, undeterred, her eyes fixing on Evelina with open hostility. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, does it not trouble you at all, presenting yourself before society in a role so far beyond your actual station? A companion's daughter, brought here to look after an ailing duchess, now parading about as though she belongs among the company of dukes and lords?" The insult was sharp and deliberately cruel, calculated to wound and to humiliate before an audience whose opinion Lady Constance clearly believed would side with her assessment of proper social boundaries. Evelina felt her cheeks flush, but she straightened her spine and met Lady Constance's hostile gaze directly, refusing to let the comment shatter the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. "I am exactly what I have always been, Lady Constance," Evelina said, her voice clear and steady despite the pounding of her heart. "A woman who has worked honestly for everything she has, who has never pretended to be anything other than what her circumstances made her. I do not claim any station beyond what I have earned through honest effort. If that troubles you, I am sorry for it, but I will not apologize for standing beside someone who values honesty over the empty performances of station and title that seem to matter so greatly to you." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the small crowd of onlookers at this response, and Evelina saw several faces shift from curious amusement to something closer to respect. Lady Constance's composed expression flickered, clearly unprepared for such a direct and dignified response, rather than the flustered retreat she had likely anticipated. "How very convenient," Lady Constance said, though her voice carried less confidence now. "That honest effort has led you so quickly into a duke's affections." "It is not convenience, Lady Constance," the Duke interjected, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with quiet authority. It is character, something you might understand better if you spent less time concerning yourself with the affairs of others and more time examining your own conduct. Miss Ashworth has never sought my favor through schemes or manipulation. She earned my respect through honesty, courage, and integrity, qualities I have found sorely lacking in far too many people who consider themselves her social superiors. The silence that followed this statement was profound, broken only by the distant sound of music continuing in the adjoining room, oblivious to the drama unfolding near the refreshment tables. Lady Constance's face had gone pale beneath her careful cosmetics, understanding perhaps for the first time that her efforts to humiliate Evelina had instead resulted in her own public embarrassment before an audience of her peers. "I see," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I see precisely how matters stand, Your Grace. I wish you joy of your unconventional choices." She turned sharply and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a silence that gradually dissolved into renewed conversation as the assembled guests processed what they had just witnessed. "Are you well?" the Duke asked quietly, turning his full attention to Evelina, his eyes searching her face with evident concern. "I am well, Your Grace," Evelina replied, and found, to her own surprise, that the words were true. Whatever fear she had carried into this evening had been replaced by a quiet, steady confidence, born from having stood her ground honestly before an audience that had expected her to crumble. "You handled her with more grace than she deserved," he said softly. "I simply told the truth," Evelina replied. "As you have taught me these past months, truth spoken plainly needs no elaborate defense." The Duke's expression softened into something warmer than Evelina had ever seen him display in public before, and though he said nothing further, the look he gave her carried a depth of feeling that needed no words to convey its meaning, leaving Evelina with the quiet certainty that whatever challenges Lady Constance or the wider county might yet present, she would face them exactly as she had faced this one, standing firmly beside the man she had come, gradually and honestly, to love. The days following the ball brought a quiet shift in how Duskmere Hall's household regarded Evelina. Where once there had been careful politeness mixed with uncertain curiosity, now there was open warmth, as though the servants had been waiting for permission to fully embrace the woman who had stood so firmly against Lady Constance before an audience of the county's most influential families. "You should have seen Lord Pemberton's face," Mrs. Whitfield reported with evident delight, having heard the story from a fellow housekeeper who had been present at the ball. "They say Lady Constance left before the dancing even began, too embarrassed to remain another hour." Evelina accepted these accounts with a modest smile, though she felt no particular satisfaction in Lady Constance's humiliation. Her thoughts remained occupied instead with the Duke's words at the ball, with the warmth in his eyes as he had defended her before the assembled guests, and with the quiet certainty that had settled in her heart regarding her own feelings toward him. It was several evenings after the ball, during a quiet hour when the Dowager Duchess had retired early and the household had settled into its evening stillness, that the Duke sought Evelina out in the library, where she had gone to return a book of poetry she had been reading aloud during the family's evening hours. "I hoped I might find you here," he said, closing the door softly behind him, an action that carried its own quiet significance, given the strict propriety that typically governs such interactions between them. "Your Grace," Evelina said, setting the book down on a nearby table, "is something troubling you?" "Many things trouble me," he admitted, moving further into the room, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen him display so openly. "But tonight, I find myself troubled most by words I have left unspoken for far too long." Evelina's heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone, and she remained quiet, sensing that whatever he intended to say required space rather than interruption. "When you first arrived at Duskmere Hall," he continued, moving to stand near the fireplace, his eyes reflecting the low flames burning within it, "I believed myself a man who required nothing beyond the careful order I had constructed around my life. Rules, customs, distance. These things had become my armor against ever being wounded again, as Marguerite had wounded me. I did not seek warmth, Miss Ashworth. I did not believe myself capable of trusting anyone enough to allow such warmth back into my life. Your Grace, you need not. Please," he said gently, "allow me to finish, for I fear, if I do not say this now, I may never find the courage to say it at all. He turned to face her fully, his storm gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Your refusal, on that very first day, to walk 3 steps behind me, shattered something in my carefully constructed world that I did not realize needed shattering. You did not simply refuse a rule, Evelina. You showed me, without meaning to, perhaps, that the loyalty I had been demanding from everyone around me was worthless, precisely because it could be demanded at all. True loyalty, true devotion, cannot be commanded through rules or customs. It can only be given freely, by someone who chooses to stand beside you, not because they must, but because they wish to. Evelina felt tears gathering in her eyes at the raw honesty in his words, understanding the courage it must have cost him to voice such vulnerability aloud, after years of guarding himself so carefully against exactly this kind of openness. I have watched you these past months, he continued, his voice growing softer, care for my mother with a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. I have watched you stand firm against Lady Constance's cruelty, with a dignity that no rule or custom could have taught you. I have watched you speak honestly, even when honesty was difficult, even when it might have cost you your position in this household. And in watching you, Evelina, I have come to understand that I do not merely respect you or admire you. I have come to love you, deeply and completely, in a way I did not believe myself capable of feeling again, after everything Marguerite's betrayal took from me. The words hung in the quiet air of the library, and Evelina felt her heart swell with an emotion so profound it nearly overwhelmed her ability to respond. She had suspected, hoped, perhaps even known in some quiet corner of her heart, that his feelings had grown to mirror her own, but hearing him speak the words so plainly, so completely without the careful distance he had once maintained, moved her beyond anything she had anticipated. Your Grace, she began, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of emotion she struggled to contain. I did not come to this household seeking anything beyond honest employment and a chance to support myself after my mother's passing. I did not expect, nor did I seek, to find my heart so thoroughly claimed by a man I believed, on that very first day, to be cold and distant, beyond reaching. And now? He asked softly, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, should she wish to. Now, Evelina said, her own voice growing steadier as she spoke the truth that had been building within her for weeks. I find that the man I believed cold and distant has revealed himself to be someone capable of extraordinary tenderness, courage, and honesty. I find that I have come to love you as well, Edmund, not for your title or your position, but for the man you have shown yourself to be beneath all of that, when you finally allowed yourself to set aside the walls you built to protect yourself. It was the first time she had spoken his given name aloud, and she saw the effect it had on him, a softening around his eyes, a slight easing of the tension he had carried in his shoulders for so long that she suspected he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to stand without that weight upon him. Evelina, he said, reaching out to take her hands in his own, his touch warm and steady. I know that what I am about to ask carries enormous complications. My position, the expectations of society, the very real prejudices that exist regarding differences in station. All of these things stand as obstacles that will not simply disappear because our hearts have found their way toward one another. But I find myself unwilling to let such obstacles prevent me from asking what I truly wish to ask. Evelina's breath caught, understanding the direction his words were heading, though she remained quiet, allowing him the space to speak fully. I do not know precisely how such a thing might be arranged, given the complications of station and society's expectations, he continued. But I know that I do not wish to spend another day of my life pretending that my feelings for you are anything less than they truly are. I know that I wish to build a future where you walk beside me, not 3 steps behind, not in some peripheral role dictated by custom or convenience, but as my equal, my partner, and, should you consent to it, eventually my wife. The word hung between them, weighted with all the complications such a proposal would inevitably bring, the scandal it would generate throughout the county, the resistance it would face from those who believed firmly in the rigid boundaries of social station. But Evelina, looking into the storm-gray eyes of the man before her, eyes that had once seemed so cold and now carried nothing but warmth and sincerity, felt only certainty settle over her heart. Edmund, she said softly, I did not come here seeking a title or wealth. or position beyond what honest work could provide. But I have come to love you, completely and honestly, and if you are certain that your feelings run as deeply as your words suggest, then I would be honored, more than I can properly express, to walk beside you for the rest of our days, whatever complications society might choose to place before us. He drew her closer then, his hand rising to gently cup her cheek, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet library, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the weight of years of guarded loneliness finally beginning to lift from both their hearts. "There will be difficulties," he said quietly, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Society will not easily accept such a match. Lady Constance and others like her will not simply abandon their objections because our hearts have found happiness together." "I have never been afraid of difficulty, Edmund," Evelina replied, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had first caught his attention on her very first day at Duskmere Hall. "I have faced difficulty my entire life, and I have always found a way to stand firm through it. I do not intend to stop now, not when what waits on the other side of that difficulty is a future built on honesty and genuine love, rather than empty custom and fear." He smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his face entirely, softening the sharp lines that years of careful distance had etched there, and Evelina felt, in that moment, that she was seeing the truest version of the man she had come to love, finally free from the armor he had carried for so long. "Then let us face whatever difficulties come," he said, "together, side by side, exactly as it should always have been." They remained together in the quiet library for some time longer, speaking softly of the future they hoped to build, of the challenges they anticipated, and the joys they hoped might outweigh them, until finally, the late hour demanded they part, each returning to their separate quarters, with hearts considerably lighter than they had carried in years. But as Evelina made her way to her small room at the end of the servants' corridor that night, she could not shake a quiet awareness that the true test of their newfound understanding still lay ahead of them, in the reactions of a society not yet ready to accept a duke who had chosen love over custom, and a companion who had chosen honesty over the safety of remaining quietly, invisibly, 3 steps behind. News of the duke's intentions could not remain private for long, not in a household where servants noticed everything, and a county where gossip traveled faster than any carriage. Within a week of that quiet evening in the library, whispers had begun circulating through Duskmere Hall's corridors, carried by knowing glances between the staff and the occasional congratulatory word, offered carefully by Mrs. Whitfield, who had clearly guessed at the shift in the household's future, even before any formal announcement had been made. The Dowager Duchess, when informed directly by her son of his intentions toward Evelina, received the news with far less surprise than either of them had anticipated. "I have watched this happen for months," she said, settling back into her chair with evident satisfaction, wondering only how long it would take the two of you to admit openly what had been obvious to everyone else in this household since the physician's visit in autumn. "I could not be more pleased, Edmund. Evelina has brought more genuine happiness into this house than I believed possible, after everything Marguerite's betrayal cost us." "You do not worry about the difficulties such a match will bring?" the Duke asked, though Evelina, present for this conversation, could hear the relief in his voice at his mother's ready acceptance. "Difficulties," the Dowager Duchess said dismissively, "are simply the price of anything worth having. I would rather see you happy and facing difficulty than miserable and comfortable, surrounded by rules that never brought you anything but loneliness." But not everyone in the county shared the Dowager Duchess's generous perspective. Lady Constance, humiliated already by her public defeat at the ball, seized upon the news of the Duke's intentions, with something approaching desperation, understanding that whatever hope remained for her own ambitions toward him would be entirely extinguished should such a marriage proceed. She began circulating a story throughout the county, carefully crafted to cause maximum damage, suggesting that Evelina had deceived the household regarding her own background, that her mother's reputation had not been nearly so respectable as she claimed, and that her sudden rise from companion to intended bride reflected calculated ambition rather than genuine affection. The story reached Duskmere Hall through a letter addressed to the Duke from a distant relative, expressing concern about the wisdom of proceeding with a match to a woman whose background had apparently come under such scrutiny. The Duke read the letter with a controlled fury, that Evelina had rarely seen him display, his hands trembling slightly as he set the paper down upon his desk. "This is Lady Constance's doing," he said grimly. "I have no doubt of it. She has manufactured lies about your mother, about your family, hoping to poison public opinion against our match before it can even be formally announced." Evelina felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, understanding that whatever peace she had found at Duskmere Hall was now under direct and deliberate attack. "What lies has she told, Edmund?" "She claims your mother was not the respected schoolteacher you have always described, but rather a woman of questionable reputation, who left her position under circumstances your family has carefully concealed. She suggests, without stating it outright, that your own conduct has followed a similar pattern, using calculated charm to secure a position far beyond what your true circumstances warrant." The accusation, though entirely false, struck at the deepest part of Evelina's identity, at the memory of her mother, whom she had loved and admired beyond anything else in her life. Tears sprang unbidden to her eyes, not from fear of what such lies might cost her, but from anger at the desecration of her mother's memory, for the sake of Lady Constance's petty ambitions. "My mother was the finest woman I have ever known," Evelina said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "She worked honestly her entire life, taught children with patience and kindness, and never once compromised her integrity for convenience or advantage. That Lady Constance would fabricate such lies about her memory, simply to prevent our marriage, is beyond anything I believed even she was capable of." "I know," the Duke said, moving to gather her gently into his arms, offering what comfort he could against the wave of anger and grief that had risen within her. "And we will address this directly, Evelina. I will not allow such lies to stand unchallenged, nor will I allow Lady Constance to escape consequence for spreading them." The Duke's response came swiftly and decisively. Within days, he had traveled personally to the village where Evelina's mother had taught for over a decade, gathering testimonials from former students, from the church rector who had known the family for years, and from neighbors who could speak directly to the character and reputation Evelina's mother had maintained throughout her life. He compiled these testimonials into a formal document, which he then circulated among the very same households that had received Lady Constance's malicious gossip. "You did not need to go to such lengths," Evelina said, when she learned of the trouble he had taken on her behalf, moved beyond words by the depth of his devotion to defending her family's honor. "I did precisely what was needed," he replied firmly. "I will not have your mother's memory tarnished by lies, nor will I allow Lady Constance to believe she can attack the woman I intend to marry, without facing direct and public consequence for her actions." The consequence, when it arrived, proved more thorough than even Evelina had anticipated. Several of the households that had initially received Lady Constance's gossip with interest now found themselves confronted with clear evidence contradicting her claims, evidence gathered directly from the very village where the supposed scandal had allegedly occurred. Lady Constance's credibility, already weakened by her public humiliation at the ball, suffered a further and more severe blow as word spread that she had knowingly spread falsehoods about a woman's deceased mother, out of jealousy and wounded pride. Lord Pemberton himself, whose ball had hosted the initial public confrontation between Evelina and Lady Constance, sent a letter to the Duke expressing his regret at having initially entertained such gossip without proper investigation, and offering his formal support for the upcoming match, along with an invitation for Evelina and the Duke to attend his next gathering as honored guests, rather than subjects of scandal. "It seems," the Dowager Duchess observed with evident satisfaction, reading through the accumulating correspondence that arrived over the following weeks, "that Lady Constance has finally overreached herself beyond what even her considerable social influence can repair. I imagine she will find herself considerably less welcome in polite society for some time to come, having revealed her true character so thoroughly to everyone who once believed her charming." Evelina felt a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow at this news, understanding the satisfaction of seeing false accusations against her mother's memory thoroughly disproven, while also recognizing the genuine unhappiness that must have driven Lady Constance toward such desperate and cruel measures in the first place. "I do not take pleasure in her downfall," Evelina admitted to the Duke one evening, as they walked together through the frost-covered gardens, her arm resting comfortably in his. "However cruel her actions, I understand something of what drove her toward them. Loneliness and unfulfilled hope, can lead people toward choices they might not otherwise make. You are more generous toward her than she deserves, the Duke said, though his tone carried admiration rather than criticism. It is precisely this quality in you, Evelina, this capacity for understanding, even those who have wronged you, that convinces me daily that I have chosen wisely in giving you my heart. Perhaps, Evelina said softly, but generosity does not mean I regret the consequences of her actions. She chose to attack my mother's memory, and whatever unhappiness drove her toward that choice, she alone bears responsibility for the damage it has caused to her own reputation. They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the frost crunching softly beneath their feet, the winter sky above them clear and bright with stars, and Evelina felt, despite the difficulties they had weathered together these past weeks, a profound sense of peace settling over her heart. Whatever challenges Lady Constance or society at large might yet present, she understood now, with complete certainty, that she and Edmund would face them together, as equals, walking side by side rather than one dictating terms to the other. The formal announcement of their engagement was made within the month, at a modest gathering attended by the Dowager Duchess's closest friends, and the few families in the county who had proven themselves genuine in their support throughout the difficulties of recent weeks. The Duke stood beside Evelina as the announcement was made, his hand resting warmly over hers, and when Lord Pemberton offered a toast to their happiness, Evelina caught the Duke's eye across the room and saw reflected there the same quiet joy and certainty that had settled so completely into her own heart. Preparations for the wedding began soon after, modest in scale despite the Duke's position, reflecting both his and Evelina's shared preference for genuine celebration over elaborate display. The Dowager Duchess, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of finally welcoming a daughter into the family whom she genuinely admired, threw herself into the preparations with an energy that surprised even her physician, who noted with evident pleasure that her health seemed to have improved considerably alongside her renewed sense of purpose and happiness. As the wedding day approached, Evelina found herself reflecting often on the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from the frightened young woman who had arrived at Duskmere Hall's gates uncertain of her welcome, to the woman who now stood on the threshold of a marriage built on honesty, mutual respect, and genuine love, rather than empty custom or convenient arrangement. She thought often of her mother during these final days of preparation, wishing she could share this happiness with the woman who had taught her, through quiet example rather than lecture, that dignity was never negotiable, and that true partnership meant walking beside someone, never beneath them. She believed, in her heart, that her mother would have approved wholeheartedly of the man she had chosen, and of the life they intended to build together, founded on precisely the principles her mother had instilled in her from childhood. And as the final days before the wedding slipped past in a flurry of preparation and quiet anticipation, Evelina felt ready, more ready than she had ever believed possible, to step forward into whatever future awaited her, walking always beside the man she loved, never 3 steps behind. The morning of the wedding arrived, with a gentle snowfall that dusted the gardens of Duskmere Hall in soft white, transforming the familiar grounds into something that felt, to Evelina, like a scene from one of the poetry books she had grown to love reading aloud during quiet evenings with the Dowager Duchess. She stood at the window of her small room, watching the snow settle gently upon the bare branches of the oak trees lining the drive, and felt a calm certainty settle over her heart despite the significance of the day ahead. "You are not nervous?" Mrs. Whitfield asked, entering with an armful of fresh linens and pausing to study Evelina's composed expression with evident surprise. "I am nervous," Evelina admitted, turning from the window with a soft smile, "but not in the way I once might have expected. I am not nervous about becoming his wife, or about the life we intend to build together. I am only nervous about the ceremony itself, about remembering every small detail correctly, and about not stumbling over my words when the moment comes to speak them." "That is not nervousness," Mrs. Whitfield said, setting down her linens and coming to stand beside her. "That is simply the natural feeling of any bride on her wedding day. But your certainty about the marriage itself, about the man you are marrying, that is something far more valuable than mere confidence in a ceremony's small details." Evelina thought of the long journey that had brought her to this moment, of the frightened young woman who had arrived at Duskmere Hall's gates so many months ago, uncertain of her welcome and burdened by grief and financial worry. She thought of the Duke's cold formality on that very first day, of his rigid rule about walking 3 steps behind him, and of her own quiet refusal that had, against every expectation, set in motion the events that had led them both to this day. The Dowager Duchess arrived shortly after, dressed in deep burgundy silk that complemented her silver hair, her eyes bright with an emotion she made no effort to hide. I could not have wished for a finer daughter, Evelina, nor could I have imagined, when you first arrived here, how thoroughly you would transform this household, and my son's heart along with it. Thank you, Your Grace, Evelina said, feeling tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. You have given me a family I did not believe I would find again, after losing my mother. I am more grateful than I can properly express. You need not express it in words, the Dowager Duchess replied gently. You have already expressed it, every day these past months, through your kindness, your honesty, and your steady presence in this household. Now come, let us prepare you properly. My son will grow impatient waiting at the chapel, though I dare say the wait will only make the moment sweeter when he finally sees you. The wedding gown, commissioned weeks before from the finest seamstress in the county, was a pale ivory silk that fell in simple, elegant lines, free from the excessive ornamentation that might have overwhelmed Evelina's natural grace. She had insisted on simplicity, and the Duke had readily agreed, understanding that elaborate display had never held any appeal for either of them, their preference always for genuine substance over empty show. As Mrs. Whitfield and the Dowager Duchess helped her into the gown, carefully arranging the fabric and securing the small pearl buttons that ran along the back, Evelina caught sight of her reflection in the tall mirror and felt a moment of quiet astonishment at the woman looking back at her. She looked, she thought, exactly like herself, only more fully realized, as though the months at Duskmere Hall had allowed some truer version of her to emerge from beneath the careful caution that grief and financial hardship had once required of her. The small chapel on the estate grounds had been decorated simply but beautifully, with sprigs of winter greenery and white ribbon adorning the pews, and candles casting warm, flickering light against the stone walls despite the gray winter morning outside. As Evelina walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Finch, who had asked for the honor of escorting her in the absence of any living male relative, she felt her heart swell at the sight of the gathered guests, faces she had come to know and trust over these past months, all turned toward her with genuine warmth and happiness. And there, at the end of the aisle, stood Edmund, dressed in dark formal attire that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the quiet strength of his bearing, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an expression of such open, unguarded love that Evelina felt her own composure nearly break beneath the weight of the emotion passing between them. The ceremony itself passed in something of a blur for Evelina, the rector's words washing over her as she focused instead on the steady warmth of Edmund's hands holding hers, on the quiet certainty in his voice as he spoke his vows, promising not merely the formal commitments of marriage, but something deeper, a promise to walk always beside her, never before her, never behind her, but always as an equal partner in whatever life they built together. When it came time for Evelina to speak her own vows, her voice remained steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest. I promise, she said, holding Edmund's gaze with the same quiet strength that had first caught his attention on her very first day at Duskmere Hall, to walk beside you always, through whatever difficulties or joys life brings us. I promise honesty, even when honesty is difficult. I promise partnership, never subservience, and love, freely given, never demanded or commanded by rule or custom, but offered willingly, every day, for as long as we both shall live. The rector pronounced them husband and wife, and as Edmund leaned forward to seal their vows with a gentle kiss, Evelina heard the assembled guests break into warm applause, a sound that seemed to fill the small chapel with joy, that matched the swelling happiness in her own heart. They emerged from the chapel into the softly falling snow, and it was there, on the chapel steps, that the true significance of their journey together crystallized into a single, powerful image. Edmund did not walk ahead of her, as custom might once have dictated. He did not gesture for her to follow at any prescribed distance. Instead, he simply offered his arm, and Evelina took it, and together they descended the chapel steps side by side, their footprints appearing together in the fresh snow, neither leading nor following, simply walking as equals into whatever future awaited them. The gathered guests, following behind them, toward the modest reception that had been prepared in the hall's largest drawing room, could not help but notice the symbolism of this simple gesture, having heard, in the months since the ball at Lord Pemberton's estate, the story of how their Duke had once demanded that women walk 3 steps behind him, and how one particular woman had refused, setting in motion the transformation that had brought them all to this joyful day. "It is a fitting image," the Dowager Duchess remarked to Mrs. Whitfield, watching the newly married couple walk arm in arm toward the hall, "considering how their story began. I do not believe my son could have chosen a more fitting way to begin their life together, walking exactly as they intend to continue, side by side, neither one commanding the other's place." The reception that followed was filled with warmth and genuine celebration, considerably different in character from the tense formal gathering that had marked Lady Constance's confrontation months before. Lord Pemberton attended with evident pleasure, offering a heartfelt toast to the couple's happiness and expressing his genuine admiration for the courage both Edmund and Evelina had shown in building a marriage founded on honesty rather than convenient arrangement. Lady Constance, notably, did not attend, having withdrawn from local society considerably following the exposure of her false claims against Evelina's mother. Evelina felt no particular satisfaction in this absence, though she noted it with a quiet sense that perhaps, in time, Lady Constance might find her own path toward genuine happiness, once freed from the bitter ambitions that had driven her toward such cruel and desperate measures. As the afternoon progressed into evening, and the celebration continued with music and dancing in the hall's grand ballroom, Edmund found a quiet moment to draw Evelina aside, leading her toward the same tall windows overlooking the frost-covered gardens, where they had first acknowledged their growing feelings for one another during the dinner party months before. "Do you remember?" he said softly, his hand resting warmly at the small of her back, "standing here on the evening of my mother's dinner party, when I first told you that I had found in you an honesty I feared I would never encounter again?" "I remember," Evelina said, leaning into his warmth as they gazed out at the snow-covered gardens together. "I remember feeling, for the first time since arriving at Duskmere Hall, that perhaps my presence here meant something more than simple employment." "It has meant everything," Edmund said, turning to face her fully, his eyes carrying the same intensity that had first unsettled her on that very first day in his study, though now, that intensity carried nothing but love and warmth. "You transformed not only my household, Evelina, but my very understanding of what loyalty and love truly mean. You taught me that devotion cannot be commanded through rules or customs, that it can only be given freely, by someone who chooses to stand beside you because they wish to, not because they must." "And you taught me," Evelina replied, reaching up to gently touch his cheek, "that even the coldest exterior can conceal a heart capable of profound tenderness and courage, once given the chance to heal from old wounds. You taught me that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the foundation upon which genuine partnership must be built." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the snow continue its gentle descent upon the gardens below, before Edmund spoke again, his voice carrying a note of quiet wonder. "I think often of that very first day, when you refused to walk 3 steps behind me. I did not understand it then, but I understand it now with perfect clarity. You were not simply refusing an old custom, Evelina. You were showing me, from that very first moment, exactly the kind of marriage and partnership you believed in, and exactly the kind of man I would need to become if I ever hoped to deserve someone like you standing beside me." "You became exactly that man," Evelina said softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "Not because I demanded it of you, but because you chose it, freely, just as true loyalty and love should always be chosen." The music from the ballroom drifted softly through the corridor, and Edmund extended his hand toward her, an invitation rather than a command, precisely as their entire relationship had always been built. "Shall we return to our guests, Duchess?" he asked, using her new title for what Evelina realized was likely the very first time, the word carrying a weight of promise and partnership that made her heart swell with quiet joy. "We shall," Evelina replied, taking his offered hand and allowing him to lead her back toward the warmth and celebration of the ballroom, walking beside him every step of the way, exactly as she always would, for the rest of their lives together. As they rejoined their guests amid the swirling dancers and warm candlelight, Evelina caught sight of her own reflection in a tall mirror positioned near the ballroom entrance, and saw, for just a moment, the image of the frightened young woman who had first arrived at Duskmere Hall's gates so many months before, uncertain and burdened by grief, transformed now into a woman standing confidently beside the man she loved, a duchess in her own right, who had earned her place not through birth or fortune, but through honesty, courage, and an unwavering refusal to ever again walk 3 steps behind anyone, regardless of title, custom, or expectation. The snow continued to fall gently outside the windows of Duskmere Hall throughout that joyful evening, blanketing the gardens in soft white, much as it had on the morning of their wedding, and Evelina understood, with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through every difficult moment since her arrival, that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she and Edmund would face them exactly as they had faced every obstacle before this moment, and together, honestly, and always walking side by side, as true partners should, never one dictating to the other, never one diminished for the comfort or convenience of the other, but simply 2 people who had found, in each other, a love strong enough to overcome old wounds, false customs, and every obstacle society might place before them. And so, on that snowy winter evening, surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed their journey from cold formality to genuine, honest love, Evelina and Edmund began their married life together, exactly as their love story had always promised it would be, not with one walking ahead and the other trailing carefully behind, but with 2 equal hearts, moving forward into whatever future awaited them, always and forever, side by side.